The classroom door slid open with a soft hiss, and every head turned to watch the late arrival. Hannah stepped inside, her dark hair slightly messy and her uniform wrinkled in places it shouldn't be. A faint smell of burned metal and ozone followed her into the room. Professor Kethler stopped talking mid-sentence. His tall, crystalline body made a sound like wind chimes when he moved, and right now those chimes were ringing with annoyance. The Velthari professor had been teaching at the Galactic Military Academy for over 200 years, and he did not like students who showed up late to his strategic warfare class. "Cadet Hannah," Professor Keffler said, his voice echoing through the large lecture hall. "You are 47 minutes late." 200 pairs of eyes from dozens of different species watched as Hannah walked down the steps toward her usual seat. She moved with an easy confidence that seemed strange for someone who had just disrupted the most important military strategy class in the galaxy. "Sorry, Professor," Hannah said simply. "Had to handle something." She slid into her seat next to June, another human student who immediately noticed the small burn marks on her sleeve. June raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He had learned that Hannah often had interesting explanations for things around them. Other students began to whisper. The Galactic Military Academy brought together the best young minds from every species in the known galaxy. Most of them had never been late to anything in their lives. Velter, a proud Zephyrian with metallic scales that shifted color with his emotions, made a sound of disgust. His scales were currently showing deep red, which meant he was angry. "Humans and their excuses," he muttered to his friend Thane, a massive Korvaxi with 4 muscular arms. Thane nodded his large head. "They think they're so special because they're new to the galaxy, no respect for proper education." Professor Kethler heard the whispers and decided this was a good teaching moment. He had been explaining theoretical rebellion suppression tactics when Hannah arrived. Perhaps the late human could contribute something useful to make up for her disruption. "Since Cadet Hannah has finally joined us," the professor said, his crystalline form catching the light as he moved, "perhaps she can enlighten the class about rebellion suppression. After all, it seems theoretical knowledge alone is not sufficient for her to arrive on time." A few students giggled. Rebellion suppression was one of the most complex topics they studied. Most species in the galaxy had not dealt with internal conflicts for centuries. The class had been struggling with even the basic concepts. Hannah looked up from organizing her notes. She seemed completely unbothered by being put on the spot. "Which type of rebellion, Professor? Resource-based, ideological, or territorial?" The giggling stopped. The classroom fell completely silent. Professor Kethler's chimes went quiet too. Those were advanced classifications that wouldn't be covered until next semester. How did a first-year human cadet know about them? "Let's say resource-based," the professor said carefully. Hannah nodded as if this was perfectly normal. "Okay, so first you need to identify the core grievances. Usually it's working conditions, profit sharing, or autonomy issues. Sometimes it's about basic survival needs not being met." She pulled out her datapad and started scrolling through what looked like detailed reports. "Then you have to assess the leadership structure. Is it centralized with one clear leader, or distributed among several groups? That determines whether you go for decapitation strikes or use gradual pressure tactics." Rena, a delicate Etherian with translucent skin, raised her hand nervously. "How do you know all this?" "We haven't studied these concepts yet." "Experience," Hannah said, as if that explained everything. Veltar's scales shifted to bright orange, which meant he was confused and annoyed. "Experience? You're a first-year cadet just like the rest of us. What experience could you possibly have?" Hannah looked at him with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to a small child. "I'm also a lieutenant commander in the Terran Colonial Marine Corps. This academy is just continuing education for me." The datapad slipped from Rena's translucent fingers and clattered to the floor. Around the room, students began to turn and stare at each other with wide eyes. Professor Kethler's crystalline form stopped its usual gentle humming completely. In his species, this was a sign of deep shock. "You're active military?" Dr. Yuan asked from the front row. The Mithrani teaching assistant's blue fur was starting to stand on end, which happened when his species was nervous. Yes, Hannah said simply. I thought everyone knew that. Don't other species send their military officers to study here? June leaned over and whispered, You never mentioned you were a lieutenant commander. You never asked, Hannah whispered back. Besides, I thought it was obvious. Most humans start military service when they're young. Young? Rena squeaked. How young? I joined when I was 16, Hannah said. That's pretty normal for humans. Some join even earlier if they show aptitude. Thane's forearms crossed over his massive chest. Impossible. No species allows children to fight wars. We don't send children to fight, Hannah explained patiently. We train them first. By the time they see real action, they're adults. I didn't get my first command until I was 18. First command? Professor Keffler finally found his voice. You commanded troops at 18? Just a small unit, Hannah said. 12 Marines. We were doing peacekeeping work on Proxima Station. Nothing too dangerous. The classroom was now so quiet that the only sound was the gentle hum of the air recycling systems. Even that seemed too loud. Dahayan, a Drachnary whose scales had turned the deep purple of anxiety, raised one clawed hand slowly. Cadet Hannah, when you say peacekeeping work, what exactly do you mean? Hannah thought for a moment. Well, that particular mission was about stopping a trade dispute from turning violent. 2 merchant guilds were fighting over shipping routes. We negotiated a settlement and made sure both sides stuck to it. And if they hadn't stuck to it? Veltar asked, his scales now cycling through several colors as his emotions shifted rapidly. Then we would have made them stick to it, Hannah said factly. Dr. Yuan's blue fur was now completely standing up. Made them how? The usual ways, Hannah said. Economic pressure, targeted arrests of troublemakers, show of force, direct action if necessary, standard peacekeeping protocol. She looked around the room at all the shocked faces staring at her. Is this unusual? How do other species handle conflicts? Professor Keffler slowly lowered himself into his chair, his crystalline form making soft chiming sounds. Cadet Hannah, most species in this galaxy have not experienced internal conflicts for hundreds of years. We study historical examples and run theoretical simulations. But how do you know if your theories work? Hannah asked, genuinely curious. We assume they will work based on logical analysis, the professor said weakly. Hannah frowned. That seems really inefficient. Half the stuff in our textbooks doesn't match what actually happens in the field. The class sat in stunned silence as the implications of what they were hearing began to sink in. This human girl, who looked barely old enough to be in university, was talking about real combat experience like it was homework. Professor, Rena said in a very small voice, why exactly are humans here at the academy if they already know how to do everything we're studying? Before Professor Keffler could answer, Hannah smiled brightly. Oh, that's easy. We're here to learn how other species handle these problems. Humans are really good at the direct approach, but we're not so great at long-term stability. We want to learn more elegant solutions. The chimes from Professor Keffler's body had taken on a distinctly nervous quality. Professor Keffler tried to regain control of his classroom, but his crystalline form was still making those nervous chiming sounds. He had taught thousands of students over the centuries, but none had ever casually mentioned real combat experience. During a theoretical discussion, let's continue with our scenario, he said, his voice not quite as steady as usual. Cadet Hannah, since you seem to have practical knowledge, perhaps you could walk us through a resource-based rebellion situation. Theoretically, of course. Sure, Hannah said, settling back in her chair. What kind of resource conflict are we talking about? Mining rights, water access, energy distribution, or something else? The professor paused. The lesson plan had been much simpler before Hannah arrived. Let's say a mining colony. The colonists are refusing to meet their quotas. Okay, Hannah said, pulling out her datapad again. First question, why are they refusing? Are the quotas unrealistic? Are working conditions dangerous, or are they not getting fair compensation for their work? Dr. Yuan, who had been taking notes for the professor, looked up nervously. In our theoretical scenario, let's say the quotas were recently increased by 60%. 60%? Hana winced. That's way too much of an increase. No wonder they're rebelling. Who made that decision? The colonial governor? Dr. Yuan suggested. Is he local or appointed from off-world? Hana asked. Does it matter? Veltar interrupted. His scales were still cycling through colors, but now they had settled on a suspicious yellow-green. Of course it matters, Hana said. Local governors usually understand the actual capabilities of their colonies. Off-world appointments often make unrealistic demands because they don't understand the situation on the ground. She scrolled through her datapad while she talked. Off-world governors are also easier to pressure through their superiors, but local governors have more community support. Different approaches needed for each. Rena raised her hand again. What kind of approaches? Well, for an off-world governor, making unrealistic demands, you document the actual mining capabilities, get testimony from the miners about working conditions, and present a clear report to his superiors showing why the quotas are impossible. Usually they'll reassign him and adjust the quotas. And if they don't? Thane asked. Then you demonstrate why the quotas are impossible, Hana said simply. How do you demonstrate that? Professor Keffler asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. You shut down mining operations until they agree to negotiate, Hana said. A few days without any output usually convinces them to listen to reason. Hein's purple scales had gotten darker. But wouldn't the miners lose income if operations shut down? That's why you coordinate with the miners first, Hana explained. You make sure they have enough supplies to last through the shutdown, and you guarantee they'll get back pay once the situation is resolved. The key is making sure the economic pressure hits the decision-makers, not the workers. June had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. Hana, you're talking about this like you've actually done it. I have, Hana said. Similar situation on Kepler 186F about 8 months ago. Mining Consortium tried to increase quotas by 50% with no increase in pay. We had it sorted in 6 days. The classroom went silent again. Dr. Yuen's blue fur was twitching now, which was a sign of extreme nervousness in his species. Cadet Hana, Professor Keffler said very carefully, when you say we had it sorted, who exactly is we? My unit, Hana said. 4-person crisis response team. I was team leader for that mission. 4 people resolved a mining colony dispute. Veltar's voice had gone up several octaves. Well, yeah. It wasn't that complicated. The consortium executives were trying to boost profits for their quarterly report. Once we showed them the math on why the quotas were impossible and convinced them that a prolonged shutdown would cost more than just paying fair wages, they agreed to negotiate. How did you convince them? Rena asked in a whisper. We demonstrated that the miners had unified support, Hana said. Showed them what a coordinated work stoppage would look like. Made it clear that fighting the miners would be more expensive than working with them. She paused and looked around the room. Although, to be honest, that one was pretty easy. Nobody wanted to fight. They just needed help finding a solution that worked for everyone. Professor Keffler was beginning to understand that he was dealing with something far outside his experience. Cadet Hana, what happens when people do want to fight? Depends on why they want to fight, Hana said thoughtfully. If it's because they're scared or angry about legitimate problems, you address the underlying issues. If it's because they're just violent troublemakers who enjoy causing chaos, you stop them. How do you stop them? Dr. Yuan asked, though his voice was barely audible. Quickly and decisively, Hana said. The longer violent people are allowed to operate, the more damage they do and the more followers they attract. You identify the actual troublemakers, neutralize them, and then work with the reasonable people to fix the real problems. Thane's forearms had tensed up. Neutralize them how? Arrest them if possible, eliminate them if necessary, Hana said matter-of-factly. Most situations don't require elimination, but sometimes there's no choice. The word eliminate hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several students had gone very pale or had changed colors in ways that indicated fear in their species. You've killed people, Veltar said. It wasn't a question. When I had to, Hannah said simply. It's not something anyone enjoys, but sometimes it's the only way to protect innocent people. She looked around at all the shocked faces. This is really bothering you guys. I don't understand why. Don't your species have military forces? We have defense fleets, Professor Keffler said slowly, for protection against external threats. But internal conflicts. Those are resolved through negotiation, mediation, economic pressure. What if negotiation fails? Hannah asked. It doesn't fail, Dr. Yuan said. We keep trying until we find a solution. But what if one side refuses to negotiate in good faith? What if they're just using the negotiation time to prepare for more violence? The professor and his assistant exchanged glances. That doesn't happen, Professor Keffler said. It doesn't happen with your species, Hannah corrected. But humans aren't like that. Some humans will absolutely use negotiation time to prepare ambush or gather more weapons or recruit more followers. If you just keep negotiating with them, they'll eventually attack when they think they have an advantage. Reno was shaking now. So you attack them first? Only if we're certain they're planning violence and there's no other way to stop them, Hannah said. But yes, sometimes preemptive action is necessary to prevent larger conflicts. She pulled up something on her datapad. Actually, that's a really good example of why I'm here at the Academy. Your species' approach to conflict resolution is amazing when it works. I want to learn how to use those techniques better. But I also need you guys to understand that not everyone is willing to negotiate honestly. Professor Keffler felt something. He had never experienced in 2 centuries of teaching. He was afraid of one of his students. Not because she seemed dangerous to him personally, but because she represented something his mind could barely process. Cadet Hannah, he said carefully, how many of these crisis situations have you been involved in? Hannah thought for a moment. This year, maybe 30 or 40? But most of those were pretty minor. Nothing that required more than a few days to resolve. 30 or 40 conflicts this year, Dr. Yuan repeated faintly. Well, humans are still settling new worlds, Hannah explained. And we're not very good at avoiding conflicts with each other. Every colony ship that goes out seems to develop at least one major dispute within the first few years. She smiled, apparently trying to be reassuring. But that's why we have crisis response teams. Most problems get solved quickly before they turn into real wars. Real wars? Veltar's scales had gone completely white, which meant terror in his species. Oh, we try to avoid those, Hannah said cheerfully. Wars are really expensive and lots of people get hurt. Much better to handle problems when they're still small. The classroom had become so quiet that everyone could hear their own heartbeats, or whatever equivalent their species had. Professor Keffler was having trouble processing what he was hearing. In his long life, he had studied conflicts from across the galaxy's history, but always as ancient events or theoretical problems. The idea that this young human had personally resolved dozens of conflicts was beyond his understanding. Cadet Hannah, he said, his voice sounding strange even to himself. You mentioned being late today because you had to handle something. What exactly did you have to handle? Hannah checked her chronometer. The Kepler 442b situation. Mining colony, about 40,000 colonists. They declared independence last week. She said this the same way she might discuss the weather. Dr. Yuan dropped his stylus, and it clattered loudly in the silent room. The Kepler rebellion? That's a level 7 classified situation. The news network said it was still ongoing. Was ongoing, Hannah corrected. We wrapped it up about 2 hours ago. Had to catch a quantum jump to make it back for afternoon classes. Veltar's scales had gone through so many color changes that they were now just flickering randomly. You personally ended a rebellion of 40,000 people? Not personally, Hannah said, looking confused by the question. That would be impossible. You don't fight all 40,000 people. Most people in any rebellion are just scared and following along because they don't know what else to do. She pulled up a file on her datapad. You identify the actual troublemakers, usually no more than 30 or 40 people in a group that size, neutralize the leadership structure, address the legitimate grievances, and provide a face-saving exit for everyone else. Rena's translucent skin had become almost completely clear, which meant she was terrified. When you say neutralize the leadership, 5 terminated, 3 in custody. Remainder accepted amnesty in exchange for cooperation, Hannah said, reading from her pad. New mining contracts signed with improved profit sharing. Colonial governor reassigned to administrative duties. Colony back to full production as of... She checked the timestamp. 53 minutes ago. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Thane finally found his voice. You killed 5 people today? I didn't personally kill anyone today, Hannah said carefully. Sue handled the cyber warfare aspects, Bin managed logistics, Nari ran psychological operations. I coordinated the overall response. But 5 people died, Hyan said, his purple scales now so dark they were almost black. 5 people chose to fight rather than surrender, Hannah corrected. We gave them multiple opportunities to stand down. They refused and opened fire on civilian targets. At that point, termination became necessary to protect innocent lives. Professor Keffler felt like his understanding of the universe was crumbling. Cadet Hannah, are you telling this class that while we have been studying theoretical rebellion, suppression, you have been actively suppressing actual rebellions? Well, yes, Hannah said. I mean, how else would you learn? Theory is useful for understanding basic principles, but you can't really know how these things work until you've seen them in practice. She looked around the room with genuine puzzlement. Wait, do other species not do this? How do you train your military officers? Hyan raised one shaking claw. We study. We run computer simulations. We analyze historical cases from centuries ago. We don't practice on real people. But that's so inefficient, Hannah said, sounding honestly confused. Half the stuff in our textbooks is wrong anyway. You can't really understand how insurgency dynamics work until you've seen how fear and hope interact in real populations under stress. Dr. Yuan pulled up his holographic display with trembling fingers. Cadet Hannah, according to this database, there have been 47 colonial disputes resolved by Terran forces in the past 6 months. Are you telling us you've participated in actual combat operations? 47 sounds low, Hannah mused. Oh, you probably don't have access to the smaller incidents. Anything under 1,000 people usually gets handled at the local level by planetary security forces. She scrolled through her datapad. Let's see. This year I've been primary response for 8 major incidents, secondary support for 15 others, and consulting for about 20 more. Plus the small stuff that doesn't get reported to galactic databases. Small stuff, Veltar repeated weakly. You know, trade disputes, labor strikes, political protests that turn violent, that sort of thing. Most of them get resolved in a day or two with minimal casualties. Minimal casualties, Rena whispered. Usually 0 deaths, maybe a few injuries. If people resist arrest, Hannah explained. The goal is always to resolve situations with as little violence as possible. Dead people can't contribute to rebuilding their communities. Professor Keffler tried to wrap his mind around what he was hearing. Cadet Hannah, in my species' entire recorded history, we have had perhaps 12 conflicts that required any form of military intervention. And those were resolved through economic pressure and diplomatic isolation. That's really impressive, Hannah said sincerely. Your species must have excellent social structures. Humans haven't figured out how to prevent conflicts yet, so we focus on resolving them quickly when they happen. How long have humans been doing this? Dr. Yuan asked. What, military operations? Forever, I think. It's just part of how we organize our societies. Someone has to maintain order and protect people from those who would hurt them. Tay, another human student who had been sitting quietly in the back, suddenly spoke up. Hana, I'm human too, and I've never been in combat. Not all humans are like you. Well, no, Hana agreed. Not everyone has the aptitude for it. Some humans are better at engineering or medicine or art or 1,000 other things. But every human society needs some people who are willing and able to fight when necessary. On my world, Tay said, we have police for local problems and a defense force in case of invasion. But we don't have people who go around the galaxy putting down rebellions. That's because you're from one of the core worlds, Hana said. Core. Worlds are stable. It's the frontier colonies that have problems. New settlements, limited resources, people under stress, no established social structures. Perfect conditions for conflicts to develop. She turned to address the whole class. The thing is, humans are really good at surviving in difficult conditions and adapting to new environments. But we're also really good at fighting each other when we disagree about how to survive and adapt. So we need people whose job it is to stop the fighting before it gets out of control. Professor Kethler's chimes had taken on a distinctly mournful quality. Cadet Hana, if humans are so prone to conflict, why are you here studying with peaceful species? Because you've figured out something we haven't, Hana said earnestly. You've created societies where large-scale conflicts don't happen. We want to learn how to do that. She leaned forward in her seat, suddenly animated. Like your textbook chapter on Velthari mediation techniques? It's brilliant. Instead of waiting for conflicts to develop and then suppressing them, you have systems that identify potential problems early and address them before anyone gets angry enough to fight. She turned to Veltar, whose scales were now a confused mixture of colors. Your species' approach to resource allocation disputes is fascinating. Very different from human methods. But the long-term success rates suggest we could learn a lot from incorporating those techniques. What are human methods? Veltar asked weakly. Well, traditionally we fight about it until someone wins, then the winner decides how to distribute resources, Hana said. It works, but it's messy and people get hurt. Your way seems much more elegant. You fight over resources? Rena squeaked. Not as much as we used to, Hana said quickly. We've gotten better at negotiating settlements. But yeah, resource disputes are one of the most common causes of human conflicts. Professor Kethler realized that this conversation had moved far beyond anything he was prepared to handle. Cadet Hana, I think we need to schedule a private meeting to discuss human military doctrine and its implications for our curriculum. Sure, Hana said cheerfully. But could we make it quick? I have a counterinsurgency briefing for the Tau SETI situation tomorrow morning, and I still need to finish reading about Zephyrian diplomatic protocols for next week's exam. The professor made a sound like breaking crystal. The rest of the class period passed in a strange, tense silence. Professor Kethler attempted to continue his lecture on theoretical conflict resolution, but every word seemed hollow after Hana's casual revelations about real warfare. Students kept glancing at the human girl who sat calmly taking notes as if she hadn't just described ending a rebellion that morning, when the class finally ended. Most students filed out quickly, whispering to each other in their native languages. But a small group lingered. Drawn by a mixture of curiosity and horror, Veltar approached Hana's desk first, his scales now a cautious blue-gray. Human Hana, he said formally, I owe you an apology. I mocked you for being late, not knowing. Not knowing what? Hana asked, looking up from packing her datapad. Not knowing you had been engaged in actual combat, Veltar said. Hana tilted her head. Would that have made a difference? I was still late to class. This response seemed to confuse Veltar even more. Of course it makes a difference. You were serving your species, protecting colonists, maintaining order across the galaxy. That's far more important than being punctual to a lecture. Is it? Hana asked. I mean, yes, the Kepler situation needed to be resolved. But I also made a commitment to be here for class. Professor Kethler arranged his schedule around teaching us. The least I can do is show up on time. June, who had been watching this exchange, finally spoke up. Hana, you stopped a rebellion this morning. I think people would understand if you Missed class entirely. But I didn't miss class, Hannah pointed out. I just got here late. The mission was supposed to wrap up yesterday, but the colonial governor was more stubborn than our intelligence suggested. Still, that's not really an excuse. I should have planned better. Dr. Yuan, who had been gathering his teaching materials, stopped and stared at her. You should have planned better? Cadet Hannah, you resolved a situation involving 40,000 people in a matter of hours? How could you have planned better? I could have anticipated that the governor would reject our initial terms, Hannah said. His psychological profile suggested he was prideful and would resist admitting he had made mistakes. I should have prepared alternative approaches that would let him save face while still accepting our terms. You have psychological profiles of colonial governors? Rena asked, her translucent form shimmering with nervousness. Of course, Hannah said. How else would you know how to approach them? Some people respond well to direct confrontation, others need to feel like they're making choices freely, others require demonstrations of strength before they'll negotiate seriously. She pulled out her datapad again. Governor Chun was a pride type with authority issues. I should have approached him through his superiors rather than trying to negotiate directly. Would have saved about 6 hours. 6 hours that you needed. To get to class on time, Hyan said, his purple scales lightening slightly as he began to understand. Exactly, Hannah said. See, this is why I'm here. Human military doctrine is very good at achieving immediate objectives, but we're not always great at efficiency or long-term planning. I want to learn how other species would have handled that situation. Professor Kethler, who had been listening to this conversation while trying to process his own shock, finally joined them. Cadet Hannah, may I ask you something? Of course. Professor, how do you cope with what you do? Taking lives, making decisions that affect thousands of people, carrying that responsibility? Hannah was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. It's not easy, she admitted. Nobody wants to hurt people. But someone has to be willing to make the hard choices when peaceful options have been exhausted. She looked around at the group of alien faces watching her. The way I see it, my job is to protect people who can't protect themselves. Sometimes that means fighting those who would harm them. Sometimes it means making decisions that some people won't like. But the alternative is letting innocent people suffer. But doesn't it affect you emotionally? Rena asked softly. Taking responsibility for so much violence? Of course it does, Hannah said. Every person who dies in one of these situations is someone's family member, someone's friend. I don't take those decisions lightly. But letting violent people continue to hurt others would be worse. She was quiet for another moment. I've seen what happens when conflicts are allowed to escalate. I've seen colonies where thousands died because nobody was willing to stop a few dozen troublemakers early on. I'd rather carry the weight of making hard decisions than live with the knowledge that I could have prevented greater suffering. Thane, who had been silent through most of this conversation, suddenly spoke up. Human Hannah, are all humans like you? Like me how? Hannah asked. Willing to fight, capable of violence, comfortable with making life and death decisions. Not all humans are military, Hannah said, but most humans are capable of violence if necessary. We're taught from childhood that sometimes fighting is the only way to protect what matters to us. What if there was another way? Dr. Yuan asked. What if conflicts could always be resolved peacefully? That would be wonderful, Hannah said sincerely. That's exactly what I'm here to learn. But in my experience, peaceful resolution requires all parties to be acting in good faith. When one side is committed to violence, peaceful people need protectors. She stood up and shouldered her bag. Look, I know this is difficult for you to understand. Your species have created amazing societies where everyone agrees to resolve disputes peacefully. But humans aren't there yet. We're working on it, but in the meantime, we need people who can handle the situations where peaceful resolution fails. Professor Kethler found himself asking the question that had been bothering him most. Cadet Hannah, what made you choose this path? Why become someone who handles violence professionally? Hannah smiled, and for a moment she looked like the young student she was rather than the hardened military officer she had revealed herself to be. When I was 12, pirates attacked my home colony, they killed my parents and took my little brother. The group around her went very still. The colony had no defenses, Hannah continued. We believed in peaceful resolution of conflicts. When the pirates demanded tribute, the Colonial Council voted to negotiate. While they were debating terms, the pirates got impatient and started killing people to encourage faster decision-making. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes had become very hard. By the time a Terran Marine response team arrived, half the colony was dead and most of the children had been taken as slaves. The response team rescued some of us, but my brother was already gone. I'm sorry, Rena whispered. So am I, Hannah said. But being sorry doesn't bring back the dead or rescue enslaved children. What brings them back is having people who are willing and able to stop the pirates before they can hurt anyone. She looked around at each of them. I became a Marine so that other children wouldn't lose their families because well-meaning people thought they could negotiate with monsters. But surely, Professor Keffler said desperately, surely there must have been some way to resolve that situation peacefully? With people who make their living by murdering and enslaving others? Hannah asked. Professor, I respect your commitment to peaceful resolution. It's created beautiful, stable societies. But some people choose to live by violence, and they can only be stopped by greater violence applied more skillfully. She headed toward the door, then paused and looked back. The good news is that most conflicts aren't with pirates or slavers. Most are with basically decent people who are scared or angry or desperate. Those situations can often be resolved with minimal violence, especially if you understand the techniques your species have developed. Is that why you're really here? June asked. To learn how to fight less? I'm here to learn how to protect more people with less violence, Hannah corrected. If I can prevent conflicts from starting, I don't have to end them after people are already dead. She smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. Plus, your professor's course on interspecies psychology is fascinating. Understanding how different species think and communicate could make negotiations much more effective. As she left the classroom, the group of students and faculty remained behind, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had learned. They had come to the academy to study theoretical warfare. They had not expected to meet someone who lived it. Word spread quickly through the Galactic Military Academy. By the next morning, everyone knew about the human student who had ended a rebellion between breakfast and lunch. Students whispered in hallways, professors held urgent meetings, and several species had sent urgent communications to their home governments asking for clarification about human military capabilities. Hannah seemed completely unaware of the stir she had caused. She attended her morning classes as usual, participated in discussions, and turned in her assignments on time. The only unusual thing was that other students now stared at her constantly. In advanced tactical theory, Professor Sekthal, an elderly Menthari with silver-scaled skin, decided to address the situation directly. The Menthari were known for their straightforward approach to difficult topics. Cadet Hannah, Professor Sekthal said as class began. I understand you have practical experience with the concepts we study here. Some experience, yes, sir, Hannah replied politely. Would you be willing to share that experience with the class? Many of my students have never seen real conflict. Hannah looked around the classroom. Yesterday's group was here, along with about 30 other students who had clearly come to hear what the human would say. What would you like to know? Let's start with something basic, the professor said. In theory, we study something called force escalation doctrine. How does this work in practice? Hannah thought for a moment. Force escalation is about using the minimum amount of force necessary to achieve your objectives. You start with the smallest intervention that might work, and only increase force levels if that fails. Can you give us an example? Professor Sekthal asked. Sure. Last month there was a situation on New Hokkaido. Labor dispute at an agricultural processing facility. Workers were upset about safety conditions and pay rates. She pulled out her datapad, which seemed to contain detailed records of every operation she had been involved in. First step was information gathering. We interviewed workers, management, safety inspectors, local government officials. Took about 6 hours to understand the real problems. And what were the real problems? Asked Merval, a crystalline whose body was pulsing with curiosity colors. Management was cutting safety equipment maintenance to boost profits, and they were paying workers below minimum standards for their planet, Hannah said. But the workers' union representative was also skimming money from union dues, so the workers didn't trust their own leadership. How did you resolve it? Professor Sackville asked. Step 1 was economic pressure. We documented the safety violations and reported them to planetary authorities. That forced the facility to shut down until repairs were made, Hannah explained. Step 2 was exposing the corrupt union representative and helping the workers elect new leadership. That doesn't sound like military action, observed Keshra, a tall avian whose feathers were ruffled with confusion. It wasn't really. Most conflicts can be resolved with information, economic pressure, and helping people organize themselves better, Hannah said. Military action is only needed when someone refuses to accept reasonable solutions and chooses violence instead. Did anyone choose violence in this situation? Professor Sackville asked. The corrupt union representative tried to hire off-world mercenaries to intimidate the workers who were calling for new elections, Hannah said. 3 mercenaries, armed with military-grade weapons, showed up at a workers' meeting. The classroom became very quiet. What happened? Rena asked, though she seemed afraid to hear the answer. I arrested them, Hannah said simply. All 3? By yourself? Thane's forearms had tensed up again. They were expecting to intimidate civilian workers, not deal with trained military personnel, Hannah explained. I identified myself as Terran. Military and ordered them to surrender their weapons. 2 of them complied immediately. The third one tried to draw his weapon. And? Professor Sackville prompted. I disabled him before he could fire, Hannah said, non-lethally. He spent 2 days in medical and then 3 months in planetary detention. The other 2 were released after questioning since they hadn't actually committed any crimes. How do you disable an armed person non-lethally? Dr. Yuan asked. He had come to observe this class, still trying to understand what he had learned yesterday. Depends on the situation, Hannah said. In that case, I used a neural disruptor to temporarily paralyze his nervous system. Very painful, but no permanent damage. He couldn't move for about 10 minutes, which was long enough to secure his weapon and restrain him properly. Veltar, whose scales were now a resigned shade of brown, asked, What if all 3 had tried to fight? Then I would have called for backup, Hannah said. 1 person can handle multiple opponents if they're not expecting serious resistance, but 3 trained mercenaries with military weapons would have required more firepower. More firepower meaning what? Professor Sackville asked. Standard procedure would be to call in my team, Hannah said. 4 trained Marines with appropriate equipment can handle a dozen mercenaries without too much difficulty. What if there had been more than a dozen? Han asked, his scales flickering between purple and black. Then we call for reinforcements. Hannah said, the beauty of force escalation is that you always have the option to bring more force to bear if needed. Most troublemakers back down when they realize they're outmatched. She looked around the classroom. The goal is never to have a fair fight. The goal is to end the situation quickly with minimal casualties. Fair fights are unpredictable and people get hurt. Professor Sackville, who had been taking careful notes, looked up. Cadet Hannah, what's the largest conflict you've personally been involved in? In terms of what? Number of people involved? Geographic area? Duration or casualties? Let's say number of people involved. Hannah scrolled through her datapad. Probably the Titan Station situation. About 100,000 station residents, maybe 15,000 actively involved in the rebellion. The numbers hit the classroom like a physical blow. Dr. Yuan actually staggered. 15,000 people were fighting? Keshra's feathers were now standing completely upright. Not all at once, Hannah said. It was a complex situation. Titan Station is a major trading hub, lots of different species and economic interests. A shipping cartel was trying to force smaller merchants out of business by manipulating docking, fees and cargo handling charges. That sounds like an economic dispute, not a military conflict, Professor Sechthel observed. It started as an economic dispute, Hannah agreed. But the cartel had hired private security forces to enforce their new policies. When smaller merchants tried to organize protests, the security forces started using violence to break them up. What did you do? Merville asked, his crystalline body now pulsing with anxious colors. We documented everything first, Hannah said. Took about a week to understand who was really in charge, how the money was flowing, which security personnel were willing participants versus just following orders, and which merchants were innocent. Victims versus active resistors. A week seems like a long time for people to suffer while you gathered information, Veltar commented. It is, Hannah admitted. But acting without understanding the situation would have made things worse. The cartel was hoping we'd use heavy-handed tactics that would turn the station population against us. So what was your approach? Professor Sechthel asked. We identified the 3 cartel leaders who were making the decisions and presented them with a choice, Hannah said. They could agree to binding arbitration with station merchants, or we could freeze their assets and shut down their operations while conducting a full investigation of their business practices. They chose arbitration? Dr. Yuan guessed hopefully. No, they chose to fight, Hannah said. They figured they had 15,000 people willing to support them, and we only had a 4-person team. How did you handle 15,000 people? Rena whispered. We didn't fight 15,000 people, Hannah explained patiently. We cut off power to cartel facilities, froze their financial accounts, and arrested their security leadership. Without pay or orders, most of their supporters just went home. What about the ones who didn't go home? Thane asked. About 300 cartel loyalists barricaded themselves in the main cargo bay and declared they would fight to the death, Hannah said. So we waited. Waited for what? Professor Sechthel asked. For them to get hungry and thirsty, Hannah said. We controlled their food and water supplies. After 2 days, they started negotiating. After 4 days, they surrendered unconditionally. No one was killed? Keshra asked, sounding amazed. 17 people were injured during the initial security crackdowns before we arrived, Hannah said. None killed during our operation, though. Sometimes patience is more effective than violence. Professor Sechthel set down his stylus. Cadet Hannah, you've described handling these situations as if they were routine problems. Is this normal for human military personnel? Pretty normal, yes, Hannah said. Humans have a lot of conflicts, so we've gotten good at resolving them efficiently. Most of our military training focuses on ending situations quickly with minimal casualties. How do other species view this? The professor asked. Hannah looked around the room at her classmates. Based on the reactions I've been getting, most species find it disturbing. I'm starting to understand that humans are unusual in how comfortable we are. By the 3rd day, the entire academy was buzzing with conversations about the human military student. Faculty members called emergency meetings. Students from different species huddled together, sharing stories and theories about human warfare capabilities. Some were fascinated, others were terrified, and many were simply confused. Admiral Zephyr, the Academy's Etherian commander, decided to address the situation directly. She called Hannah to her office for what she diplomatically termed a cultural exchange discussion. Admiral Zephyr's office was designed to be calming. Soft lighting, flowing water features, and plants from dozens of peaceful worlds created an atmosphere of tranquility. The Admiral herself was a tall, graceful being whose translucent skin showed the gentle blue glow that indicated serenity in her species. Please sit down, Cadet Hannah, the Admiral said. Her voice like distant music. Hannah took the offered chair and waited politely. She had been called to superior officers' offices before, though usually it was for mission briefings rather than cultural discussions. I've been hearing interesting reports about your classroom contributions, Admiral Zephyr said carefully. Your professors and fellow students seem quite impressed by your practical experience. I hope I haven't been disruptive, Admiral, Hannah said. I try to participate appropriately in class discussions. Oh, you haven't been disruptive at all, the Admiral assured her. Quite the opposite. However, I think there may be some misunderstandings about human military culture that we should address. She activated a holographic display showing recent news reports. For instance, the news networks are reporting that the Kepler 442b rebellion was resolved by unknown intervention, but our intelligence sources suggest it was handled by a small Terran military unit. Yes, Admiral, my unit was assigned to that operation. And you personally commanded this operation? Yes, Admiral. It was within my authority level as a lieutenant commander. Admiral Zephyr paused, trying to process this. Cadet Hannah, help me understand something. You hold the rank of lieutenant commander in your military, which I believe is equivalent to our rank of senior combat leader. That's typically a position held by officers with 15 to 20 years of experience. Human rank progression works differently, Hannah explained. We promote based on competence and mission success rather than time in service. I've been very successful in my assignments. How old are you, if you don't mind me asking? 19. Admiral, the Admiral's gentle blue glow flickered. In Etherian society, 19-year-olds were barely considered adults, let alone military leaders capable of resolving planetary conflicts. And how long have you been in military service? 3 years active duty, but I've been training since I was 14. Training for what, specifically? Crisis response, conflict resolution, tactical command, psychological operations, logistics management and related skills, Hannah said. Standard preparation for colonial security work. Admiral Zephyr was quiet for a long moment. Cadet Hannah. Most species in the galaxy consider military service to be a peaceful profession. Our officers manage defense fleets, coordinate emergency responses, and study historical conflicts. What you're describing sounds more like ... Like what, Admiral? Like professional warfare, the Admiral said quietly. Well, yes, Hannah agreed. That's exactly what it is. Humans have been fighting each other for thousands of years. We've gotten very good at it, but why? Admiral Zephyr asked, her blue glow now tinged with confusion colors. Why haven't humans developed peaceful conflict resolution methods like other species? Hannah considered this question seriously. I think it's because humans spread out across the galaxy so quickly. Most species developed their conflict resolution methods over thousands of years while living on their homeworlds. They had time to create stable societies and work out their differences. And humans didn't have that time? Humans left Earth before we had really figured out how to live peacefully with each other, Hannah said. We took our conflicts with us. To the stars? Every human colony starts with people from different cultures, different economic backgrounds, different political beliefs, all trying to survive in a dangerous environment with limited resources. She leaned forward slightly. Plus, space is really dangerous. Equipment failures, hostile environments, resource shortages, any of these can kill an entire colony if people aren't willing to make hard decisions quickly. Humans developed military-style organization because it's efficient for survival situations. But surely, as human society matured, you could have transitioned to more peaceful methods? Some human worlds have, Hannah said. The core worlds, where basic survival is no longer an issue, are much more peaceful. But the frontier colonies still face survival challenges every day. And there are always some humans who choose to live by taking things from others rather than building for themselves. You mean criminals? Pirates, slavers, raiders, corrupt officials, criminal cartels, Hannah listed. Humans who prey on other humans. Someone has to stop them, and peaceful negotiation. Doesn't work with people who see violence as a legitimate business model. Admiral Zephyr was beginning to understand something that disturbed her deeply. Cadet Hannah, are you telling me that human society regularly produces individuals who choose violence as a lifestyle? Not regularly, Hannah said. Maybe 1 or 2% of the population. But with billions of humans spread across hundreds of worlds, that's still millions of potential troublemakers. And your military's job is to control these troublemakers? Our job is to protect everyone else from them, Hannah corrected. We also help resolve disputes between basically good people before they turn violent, coordinate emergency responses. Maintain order during crises and support colonial development. You said you've been training since you were 14. Who decided you should become a soldier? I did, Hannah said simply. After the pirate attack on my colony, I knew I wanted to protect other people from going through what my family went through. And your government allowed a 14-year-old to make that choice? My government provided the training I requested, Hannah said, but the choice was mine. Human society believes that people should be free to choose their own paths as long as they're willing to accept the responsibilities that come with those choices. Admiral Zephyr stood up and walked to her window, which looked out over the Academy's peaceful gardens. Students from dozens of species were studying together, discussing theoretical problems that most of them would never face in reality. Cadet Hannah, she said finally, how do you view your classmates here? Students who have never seen real conflict? I think they're fortunate to come from societies that have solved the problems humans are still working on, Hannah said honestly. And I think they have a lot to teach us about preventing conflicts instead of just resolving them. Do you think humans are dangerous compared to other species? Humans are definitely more comfortable with violence than most species, Hannah said. But dangerous to whom? I've never heard anyone who wasn't trying to hurt innocent people. Most humans are like that. We're dangerous to those who would harm others, protective of those who need help. But you carry weapons, you make life and death decisions, you command military operations that affect thousands of people. Because someone has to, Hannah said. Admiral, with respect, your species lives in a beautiful, peaceful galaxy where conflicts are resolved through discussion and compromise. But that galaxy only exists because species like humans are willing to deal with the small percentage of beings who reject peaceful solutions. Admiral Zephyr turned back to face her. Are you saying that humans serve as enforcers for galactic peace? Not intentionally, Hannah said. We're mostly just trying to keep our own colonies safe and functional. But yes, I suppose human. Military forces do end up dealing with a lot of problems that other species can't or won't handle themselves. Problems like the Kepler Rebellion? The Kepler situation was 40,000 humans who were unhappy with their government, Hannah said. Other species couldn't have resolved that because they don't understand human psychology well enough. And even if they did understand it, most species aren't willing to use the level of force that was necessary to end the violence quickly. Was that level of force really necessary? The rebel leaders had started executing colonists they accused of being government sympathizers, Hannah said quietly. Every day we delayed intervention meant more innocent people died. Sometimes you have to choose between using force to stop violence or allowing violence to continue. Admiral Zephyr felt something she had never experienced before. She was grateful for the existence of a type of person she found morally disturbing. Cadet Hannah, what do you hope to accomplish here at the Academy? I want to learn how to protect people without having to hurt anyone, Hannah said. Your species and others here have created methods for resolving disputes that humans haven't mastered yet. If I can learn those methods and teach them to other humans, maybe we can reduce the amount of violence needed to maintain order. And if you can't? If humans continue to require military solutions to their problems, then humans like me will continue to provide those solutions, Hannah said. But hopefully with greater skill and wisdom so fewer people get hurt in the process. Admiral Zephyr realized that this young human repper. News of Admiral Zephyr's meeting with Hannah spread through the Academy's faculty within hours. By evening, an emergency council meeting had been called. Representatives from 12 species gathered in the Academy's main conference room, their various forms creating a bizarre but familiar assembly of galactic diversity. Professor Keffler presented his analysis first, his crystalline form humming with nervous energy. Colleagues, I believe we are facing a fundamental challenge to our understanding of galactic civilization. Explain, requested Counselor Thalmus, an ancient Vorthan whose stone-like skin had weathered countless decades of peaceful deliberation. The human student has revealed that her species routinely engages in what we would classify as active warfare, Professor Kethler said. Not historical conflicts or defensive actions, but ongoing military operations across human space. How ongoing? Asked Dr. Nelthara, a graceful Sylvani whose plant-like features rustled with concern. According to the data we've been able to gather, Terran military forces have been involved in over 200 conflict resolution operations in the past year alone, Dr. Yuen reported, his blue fur still twitching with anxiety. And those are? Just the ones reported to galactic databases. 200 conflicts? Counselor Thalmus' stony features showed shock. In 1 year? The human indicated that many smaller incidents aren't reported at all, Professor Kethler added. She described them as routine maintenance of colonial order. Admiral Zephyr, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. I've been reviewing intelligence reports from across human space. What we're seeing at this academy appears to be representative of human military culture as a whole. What do you mean? Dr. Nelthara asked. I mean that humans have industrialized warfare, Admiral. Zephyr said, they've created systematic methods for identifying, managing, and resolving conflicts efficiently. It's not chaotic violence, it's organized, professional, and apparently very effective. But why? Asked Professor Murthick, an elderly Quelling, whose feathered head crest was flattened with distress. Why would any species choose such a path? I don't think they chose it, Admiral Zephyr said. I think it was chosen for them by their circumstances. Humans expanded into space before they had developed stable social structures. They've been dealing with the consequences ever since. Dr. Yuen pulled up a holographic display showing human colonial expansion. Look at this pattern. Humans have established over 3,000 colonies in less than 2 centuries. Most species take millennia to establish even a few dozen stable settlements. That's incredibly rapid expansion, Counselor Thalmus observed. Too rapid for social stability. Professor Kethler agreed. Each new colony represents a potential source of conflict. Different groups of humans with different values and goals, competing for limited resources in dangerous environments. And their solution is military force? Dr. Nelthara asked. Their solution is systematic conflict management, Admiral Zephyr. Corrected. Military force is just one tool they use. From what I can determine, they also employ economic pressure, psychological operations, diplomatic negotiation, and social engineering. Professor Murthick ruffled his feathers nervously. That sounds terrifyingly comprehensive. It is, Admiral Zephyr agreed. But it's also terrifyingly effective. Human colonies have one of the highest survival rates in the galaxy, despite being established in some of the most challenging environments. What are the implications for galactic security? Counselor Thalmus asked. This was the question everyone had been avoiding. Admiral Zephyr stood and walked to the large viewing window that showed the Academy's grounds and the stars beyond. Humans currently represent about 12% of galactic population, she said. But their military capabilities appear to be far beyond what any other species maintains. Are they a threat to other species? Dr. Yuen asked quietly. Not directly, Admiral Zephyr said. All available evidence suggests that humans focus their military efforts internally. On managing conflicts within human space, they seem to have little interest in conquering or controlling other species. But, Professor Kethler prompted, sensing there was more. But they've become the de facto enforcers for situations that other species can't handle, Admiral Zephyr said. The Kepler situation, for instance. If that rebellion had involved any other species, how would we have resolved it? The room fell, silent as the implications sank in. We would have tried negotiation first, Dr. Nelthara said eventually. For how long? Admiral Zephyr asked. As long as necessary, Professor Murthick said. And while we negotiated, people would have continued dying, Admiral Zephyr pointed out. The human approach ended the violence in hours instead of months or years. But at what cost? Dr. Yuan asked. 5 people died in that operation. How many would have died if the rebellion continued for months? Admiral Zephyr countered. The human may have saved hundreds or thousands of lives by acting decisively. Counselor Thalmus spoke slowly, his stone features grave. Are we discussing the possibility that humans serve a necessary function in galactic society? I think we're already past discussing possibilities, Admiral Zephyr said. I think we're looking at an established reality. Humans have become the species that other species call when peaceful methods fail. But we never call them, Professor Keffler protested. Don't we? Admiral Zephyr asked. Who handled the Rigel Station crisis last year? Who resolved the mining disputes in the Centauri system? Who stopped the pirate raids in the Outer Rim? She pulled up a series of reports. In every case, the official records show resolution by local authorities, or peaceful settlement achieved. But the classified reports all mention Terran military advisors or intervention forces. You're saying humans have been quietly managing galactic security without most of us realizing it? Dr. Nelthara asked. I'm saying humans have been managing the problems that our peaceful methods couldn't solve, Admiral Zephyr said. And, they've been doing it so efficiently that most of us never noticed. The room was quiet for several minutes as each representative considered what they had learned. Finally, Counselor Thalmus spoke. What do we do with this knowledge? I think, Admiral Zephyr said carefully, we need to decide whether we're comfortable with the current arrangement or whether we want to try to change it. What would changing it mean? Professor Murthick asked. It would mean either developing our own capabilities for handling violent conflicts, or accepting that some problems can't be solved peacefully, Admiral Zephyr said. Either option would require fundamental changes to how our species organize. They're societies, and if we accept the current arrangement, then we acknowledge that galactic peace depends partly on human willingness to handle the dirty work that we prefer not to think about, Admiral Zephyr said. And we try to learn from them how to prevent conflicts from reaching the point where violence becomes necessary. Dr. Yuan looked up from his notes. Is that why the human student is here? To teach us prevention? I think she's here to learn prevention from us, Admiral Zephyr said. But yes, there might be value in learning. From each other? What about the other human students? Professor Keffler asked. Are they all military personnel too? Admiral Zephyr checked her files. No, most human students here are civilians. But they all come from a society where military service is common and respected. They understand conflict in ways that our students don't. Should we be worried about having military personnel in our classrooms? Counselor Thalmus asked. Should we be worried about having teachers in our classrooms? Admiral Zephyr countered. Because that's what Cadet Hannah has become, whether we intended it or not. She's teaching our students about realities they've never had to face. Is that good or bad? Dr. Nelthara asked. I think, Admiral Zephyr said, it's necessary. Our students are going to graduate and take positions in government, military command, and diplomatic service. They need to understand how conflict actually works, not just how we wish it worked. Professor Keffler S. Chimes had taken on a thoughtful quality. So we continue the current arrangement? Humans in our classrooms learning our methods while teaching theirs, for now, Admiral Zephyr said. But I think we also need to establish formal protocols for cooperation with human military forces. If we're going to rely on their capabilities, we should do so openly and responsibly. And if their methods prove incompatible with our values? Counselor Thalmus asked. Admiral Zephyr looked out at the stars again. Then we'd better hope we never face situations where peaceful methods fail, because the alternative to human efficiency might be much worse than anything we've seen so far. 3 months later, the Galactic Military Academy had settled into a new normal. Hannah continued attending classes, though now she was frequently asked to provide real-world context for theoretical discussions. Her fellow students had gradually moved from fear to fascination to a grudging respect for her expertise. The changes went deeper than just classroom dynamics. Several professors had revised their curricula to include case studies from recent human operations. The library had acquired hundreds of human military manuals and after-action reports. Most significantly, the Academy had established a new program, Cross-Species Conflict Resolution Studies. Professor Keffler found himself co-teaching this new course with Hannah, an arrangement that would have been unthinkable a few months earlier. Today's class was discussing the integration of peaceful negotiation techniques with rapid response capabilities. The key insight. Professor Keffler was explaining to a classroom that now included students from 15 different species, is that different approaches work better for different types of conflicts. Hannah nodded from her position at the front of the room. Professor Keffler's mediation techniques are incredibly effective for disputes between parties who want to find a solution but don't know how. The Velthari consensus-building methods we studied last week can prevent most conflicts from even starting. But, she continued, some conflicts involve parties who don't want solutions. They want to win, or they want to hurt others, or they're using conflict as a way to gain power. For those situations, you need different tools. Veltar, whose scales had gradually returned to their normal colors over the past months, raised his hand. Human Hannah, how do you determine which type of conflict you're dealing with? Good question, Hannah said, pulling up a decision matrix on the classroom display. You start by analyzing the stated goals versus the actual behavior of each party. She highlighted different sections of the matrix. If someone says they want fair treatment, but they keep rejecting reasonable offers, they probably want something else. If someone says they want to negotiate, but they use negotiation time to prepare for violence, they're not serious about peace. What? About situations where the goals change? Asked Mira, a new student from the Centauri colonies. Where parties start with legitimate grievances but become radicalized during the conflict. That's actually very common, Hannah said. Prolonged conflicts tend to escalate, especially if early intervention attempts fail. That's why speed is often more important than perfection in conflict resolution. Dr. Yuen, who had become much more comfortable with these discussions, looked up from his notes. Can you give us an example of how this works in practice? Sure, Hannah said. Last month there was a situation on New Geneva. Started as a standard labor dispute. Miners wanted better safety equipment and higher pay for dangerous work. She pulled up a file on her datapad. Initial assessment suggested this was a perfect case for Velthari mediation techniques. Both sides had legitimate interests, room for compromise, and respected leadership. What happened? Professor Keffler asked. The mediation worked beautifully, Hannah said. We reached a tentative agreement in 3 days. Improved safety protocols, graduated pay increases tied to productivity metrics, profit sharing for exceptional performance. Everyone was happy, but Veltar prompted, sensing there was more to the